It was a question, like I had told myself that and been trying to get myself to admit to this problem for probably 3, 4 years now at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Taking breaks, and I'd get to this point of pain, I admit to this problem, I'd make myself these promises that I wasn't going to drink anymore, I was going to drink less, then I'd break the promises, and I was in this shame cycle where I couldn't even look in the mirror. I felt so loathing of myself. How can I be smart and in control in every other area of my life? But this is this strange and painful exception.
So, Annie, can you share a bit about your personal journey and really what prompted you to evaluate your own relationship with alcohol?
Yeah, so when I was actually, so way back, I grew up in a tiny one-room cabin with no running water or electricity, and we had a snowmobile to school and get wood to burn it in the stove to stay warm. We had coolers instead of a refrigerator. It was definitely of another era. And this is relevant because the reason I grew up that way is because my parents were hippies and they didn't drink. I didn't know either of my parents to drink alcohol. And so when I went to college, I just also didn't really drink. I didn't have a cautionary tale. They weren't like anti-alcohol, but I wasn't really into it and had a few drinks here and there. But then I went and I moved with my husband to New York City right after college. And I remember going out for the first time and being invited out, and it was like the drink was $25 in 2005, and I was like, I have student loan debts, this is ridiculous. So I was like, I'm not going to do that regularly. And so
Right, sure.
fast forward sort of, I had been promoted, I was in another role, and I actually had my boss come up to me and say, like, why aren't you joining us for happy hour? And I was like, oh, I don't really drink. And he's like, oh, Annie. And he like took me under his wing. He's like, that is not what it is about. It is about coming out, getting your ideas known. Happy hour in New York City is kind of like the golf course. If you care about your career, this is important. And so, Molly, I like made a plan. I thought, okay, well, I'm going to drink a pint of water and then a glass of wine and a pint of water, and I'm just going to alternate them to make sure I never get too tipsy. Because I had seen people out, kind of
Sure.
torpedoing their careers by being too drunk.
Right.
And I would even go so far as to go into the bathroom sometimes and try to throw up the last glass of wine if I felt like I was getting too tipsy, just so I could stay out and keep up with all of these colleagues who were mostly men and who were mostly twice my age. And it was very, I can't tell you the delineation, but fast
Mhm.
forward a decade, and I had gotten promoted multiple times. I was global head of marketing for this company I was working for, and I was drinking 2 bottles of wine pretty much every single night.
Mm. And so then you took a deep dive into you wrote the book The Naked Mind. You started by gathering knowledge deeply, and you've really in so many ways, Annie, flipped so much of this conversation around people's relationship with alcohol on its head. And what I love, which is such a positive sort of approach to the way that you've done it. Tell me this, what is the core philosophy behind the naked mind, and when did you sort of pull back and say this isn't sustainable? 2 bottles of wine a night is not sustainable. I got a problem. I've got to fix it.
So let me tell you how it's interesting because I actually wasn't really able to articulate why it worked until the last maybe 2 years.
Mm,
And which is fascinating because it's worked for so many other people. But the process for me that I went through is I was actually coming back from London and I'd been drinking late that night up to like 3 in the morning with a bunch of colleagues. And I had to get up at 6 in the morning to get on the train. And I was so hungover and I was so miserable. And I went into the hotel bar and I asked if I could have a mimosa, because that in my mind was sort of a acceptable morning drink. And the
mm,
waitress said, well, I'm not going to open the bottle of champagne this early because it will go flat before any other guests. And she's like, unless you're going to drink the whole thing. And I was like, oh, no, of course not. And and so she's like, but I could give you a screwdriver, which was vodka and orange juice. And I'd
mm,
never drank hard alcohol in the morning. I thought that's one of those little lines that if I don't cross that line, then I'm surely
mm,
not, an alcoholic. But I was super desperate. I just wanted to feel better. So I had like 2 or 3 of those. And I remember getting to the airport and feeling so miserable. I had this pit in my stomach. I started crying. Had my journal out, and I was just writing like, I definitely have a problem. And it was a question, like I had told myself that and been trying to get myself to admit to this problem for probably 3-4 years now at this point. Taking breaks, and I'd get to this point of pain. I admit to this problem. I'd make myself these promises that I wasn't going to drink anymore. I was going to drink less. Then I'd break the promises, and I was in this shame cycle where I couldn't even look in the mirror. I felt so loathing of myself. How can I be smart and in control in every other area of my life? But this is this strange and painful exception. And it was in that moment of, again, asking myself those same questions. Do I have a problem? Am I an alcoholic? What is wrong with me? That just kind of in this like very, I would almost say like spiritual moment, I had this other question, which was why? Why did I used to be able to take it or leave it? Why is alcohol now, so important to everything when I didn't even drink for, into my adult years? And I made a commitment to myself in that moment that I gave myself a year, and I was like, I'm going to stop trying to stop drinking, and I'm going to answer why. And I made a list of every single reason I drank. And we live in this amazing day and age where you can literally just download scientific studies off the internet, read them, understand. And I went through literally every reason, all about what alcohol is and does in the brain, what it does neurologically, why we use it to fit into society, how it's marketed. And through this process, I literally lost my desire to drink. And without desire, there's no temptation.
Yeah.
And I just
love
wasn't.
how you talk about that. So good. Without desire, there's no temptation. I'm sorry, keep going. This is so good.
So that was my process. And then I had all of this research, and at every turn, I must have made my husband so crazy because I was like, did you know? Oh my God, how are we all hoodwinked? I can't believe that this is acceptable. And I remember thinking of things like, if aliens would come and ask us about drinking, what would we tell them? Like, it doesn't make you feel very good. It gives you like 20 minutes of a high, then it gives you a hangover. It's expensive. Like they would really wonder. And it was so fascinating for me to have this massive paradigm shift about this substance that we just consume mindlessly. I had a friend actually, after she read my book, she's like, I was an accidental drinker. It was just what you did. I just fell into it. I never thought about it. And she's like, I'm so grateful because you gave me, I didn't have like a problem, but you gave me the ability to think about it and to critically look at it with my mind, with intelligence. And it's interesting because, Molly, we know more about like the side effects of Advil than we do about alcohol. And yet we ingest a lot more alcohol, and so I had all of this research that I had just found mind-blowing and staggering. And I was working in my job. I had no intention of leaving my job, but I wanted to get this out there somehow. So I kind of figured out how to put a PDF online, not even necessarily like you didn't have to give an email address or anything. I just stuck it up there. And 20,000 people downloaded it in 2 weeks. I shared it in a few different groups. And on my Facebook page, and it just went viral. And I had my email in there. I received like 7,000 or 8,000 emails from people all over the world saying, hey, this helped me when nothing else did. And there was this one email, and he's like, you should make this a book. You should self-publish it. And I was like, I don't know how to do that. And he sent me a link to CreateSpace on Amazon. And so in 2015, I self-published This Naked Mind, and then in 2018, it had sold enough copies that it's now traditionally published with Penguin Random House. But that's how it began.
It's unbelievable, and I think what's so interesting is your approach wasn't started. You didn't want to start with the behavior, which is so different and counterintuitive to where most traditional, sort of whether it's a rehab place or what their approach to it. And so, what was it that made you consider I'm going to do all this research, but I'm not going to try to stop drinking while I do, and I'm not going to try to change the behavior while I do. I've heard you talk about that. It's so interesting.
And that is what I'm finally able to really put words to. And I've even called my approach now affective liminal psychology. Affective is your emotions. Liminal is the space between your conscious and your subconscious mind. And psychology is just the methodology of like why we do what we do, why the mind creates our behaviors. And for me personally, it was just not it was literally the Einstein's definition of insanity, of doing the same thing over and over and it not working. And so I just
Mm-hmm.
reached threshold of it not working one way, and
Mm-hmm.
there was just this moment of like, okay, I have to try something different because this is
Mm-hmm.
not working.
Right.
But what I know now and what I've seen now with, well, I have a free alcohol experiment. 500,000 people have gone through it. And so I have like huge data sets of like people's experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And over and over, when we focus on how we feel toward the substance, or how we feel, even more importantly, sometimes towards ourselves, and we actually put the behavior on the back burner, the behavior takes care of itself.
Sounds.
And it's so fascinating. And you think about that, like everything we do, we approach with like, okay, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to force myself to do it. But if you consider like willpower, when we think about the human will, like the will is the thing that we hold in highest esteem, right? If somebody's will is subverted, it's some of the most heinous crimes. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, what we're literally doing to ourselves is there's a part of us that not only wants to drink, but honestly, for a lot of people, have started to use alcohol for self medication. So there's a part of ourselves that's drinking as an act of self preservation, drinking as an act of self love, drinking as an act to cope, right? To handle the anxiety, the depression, the intensity, the stress of what's going on in our lives. And then we're using this will, this shame and blame to kind of say, no, we're not going to do that, even though we believe it's good for us. And what happens is we incite this major war inside our
Yeah.
own minds. And so,
Mm-hmm.
usually, when somebody starts to try to drink less or nothing, and this was true for me too, at that moment, over time, you actually start drinking more. And you start drinking more because you've created this pain. It's called cognitive dissonance, but this cognitive is thinking and dissonance is disagreement. And you have this pain inside your own mind. And what do we do? What have we trained ourselves to do when we're in pain? Is drink.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're
Mm-hmm.
on this like self-perpetuating spiral. And so if you can just say, okay, wait a second, so the first step of my process is actually end cognitive dissonance. I'm actually going to stop trying to stop. I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to awaken self compassion and curiosity. And then I'm going to learn something. The second step of the process is we rewire the subconscious belief systems. And
Mm-hmm.
we do that through authority, which drops right below the conscious to the subconscious. If somebody in a white coat gives you a diagnosis, your body actually physically responds. There's studies to show you will like manifest that. It's, also known as the placebo effect, but
Mm-hmm.
authority. And so I do that with scientific studies and neurological studies about what's happening in your brain and your body. Repetition, which is traditionally known to be able to rewire the brain, and of course, emotion through stories and experiences like your own personal experiential emotion. And then the third step is really to adopt an experiment mentality, which is where we try the new behavior without any heaviness. So I
Right.
never say stop trying to like drink forever. In fact, I
Mm-hmm.
think that's wildly counterproductive. I don't even
Mm-hmm.
call myself sober. I say I drink as much as I want whenever I want. I just haven't had a drink in 9 years. And I
Right.
say, make a goal you can win. If it's an hour,
Mm-hmm.
if it's a day, and train your brain to build on successes and get really
Mm-hmm.
curious about your experience. It's never a relapse, it's a data point. And
Yeah.
then really doing the work to just build a life you don't actually want to escape, which solves the whole problem itself. But it's really
Right.
those four steps. So ending cognitive dissonance, rewiring your subconscious belief system, adopting that experiment mentality with the behavior. So it's the first time behavior is introduced into the process, and then building that life you don't want to escape from by really
Mm-hmm.
making peace with all these inner voices and inner parts that are kind of in battle with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. That's outstanding. Annie, the term alcoholic, it's so arbitrary, and you talk about that. How is someone supposed to know if they have a problem?
Well, it's absolutely fascinating because the term alcoholic is not actually scientifically or medically used. It's just part of our kind of cultural common knowledge, but there isn't a definition for it. So when you would go into your doctor and say like, "Am I an alcoholic?" they would say, "Only you can know."
Mm-hmm.
But now we've evolved past that, thankfully, a little bit. And now there is an 11 question alcohol use disorder. But the amazing thing about the alcohol use disorder 11 questions is if you answer two yes, you have alcohol use disorder. And so two of those questions are, do you ever need to drink more than you used to get the same effect? So have you built any sort of tolerance? Every drinker I know would say yes. Or have
Sure.
you ever had a bout of drinking where you feel like you overdid it or you drank too much? Again, every drinker I know would say yes. So by that definition, this isn't a question or a conversation for some fringe part of the population that are alcoholics. It's an everyone conversation. And so if we can just like sort of put that term, that shaming label aside, it's such a barrier to change. Because if you have to admit to being an alcoholic to change, you're going to put off that admission for as long as possible because it's literally defined in our minds as a life sentence. And you have to go to meetings for the rest of your life. And by the way, you're not going to be able to socialize how you used to. You're going to be outside of everything. Nothing will be fun. And you'll basically be miserable. So, like, we're not going to admit that to ourselves until something really bad happens. So, by definition, it really perpetuates this rock bottom experience, which isn't necessary. A big part of my journey was that I never reached any proverbial rock bottoms. I certainly had emotional experiences that were like, oh, but I didn't wreck my car. I didn't lose my job. And I feel like if we can back up this conversation to where people aren't asking, am I an alcoholic? They're simply asking, would I be happier drinking a bit less? Or would I be happier, maybe drinking nothing at all?
Why don't we talk about alcohol like we do other addictive substances?
Oh, it's really fascinating. I don't actually know, and I've looked into it, but I don't know why exactly. I have theories. It's been drugs and alcohol, and even as things have started to become legalized, right? Like marijuana and mushrooms and all of these other things, we still have this thing where we don't really want that advertised on TV. It doesn't feel comfortable to us. Yet we can advertise
Sure.
to like all my young boys are watching all the football all the time, and
Right.
there's so many. I remember we're Broncos fans, and when Peyton Manning won the Super Bowl for the Broncos, he got up and he's like, "I want to hug my wife and have a Budweiser." And both my kids look at me like, "Did he just say that because of what I do?" And
Uh-huh.
I was like, "No, it's like don't worry, and he can still be your hero and all this stuff." But it's so entrenched
Yeah.
in our society. If I was going to theorize and guess, alcohol is there's a huge profit margin in alcohol. Most bars and restaurants would literally go out of business if they didn't have alcohol to support them. And it's heavily taxed. So there's a huge like financial incentive. And if you even look at the disclaimer that in the US we have to put on the bottle, it's drink responsibly, which if you look at that, we're literally saying, okay, human being, the one with like blood and flesh and bones and brain cells, if you can't ingest an addictive substance responsibly, then you are the problem. It's not that the drug is the problem. But if you look into the science and the literature, it's been like definitively shown in multiple studies that not only is alcohol a drug, but it is the most harmful drug, meaning it causes the most harm to our society overall than any other drug. And the World Health Organization a few years ago came out with a study that says no amount of alcohol is safe for the human body. So but those studies, they don't get widely shared because social currency, we don't want to share something that makes us look like a party pooper or a Debbie Downer. And so they kind of get a bit swept under the rug.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, it was always interesting and telling at some level during COVID. Everything was closed, but you could go to the wine store or the liquor store and get, whatever. I mean, it was always sort of relative to the financial implications of it, right?
Absolutely.
Your approach doesn't center around the negative impact of alcohol, but you say that in writing the book and through all of your extensive research, you realized that so many people don't know the effects of it. And at some level, when you understand that there is pretty much nothing good about it, it doesn't do anything directly to serve you physically and mentally, emotionally, relationally, if you really break it down like you have. What are some of the big ones, though, Annie, that are important for people to know, for all of us to know, around the negative impacts of it on our bodies and on ourselves?
It was so interesting for me because I knew that the scare tactics had not been working. I mean, I was working in the UK and they had their cigarette packages with these just horrible graphic images of mouth cancer and terrible things. And people were still buying cigarettes. And I knew from my own experience that I would scare myself. I would take a little bit of a break, then I would induce more blame and shame. Then I would feel guiltier when I was drinking. And I was just making the entire internal conversation worse. So I was so anti putting anything negative in the book, but actually my I had hired an independent editor and she's like, you have to tell me why not to do it. And I was like, okay. So I reluctantly wrote this chapter after I had written the entire rest of the book. But it's such a good question. And some of the really important ones are, if you think of COVID, for example, or we're learning so much about like gut health, right? Alcohol, if you put it on your skin, it's literally what's in hand sanitizer. It's the same sort of substance. Interestingly, it is also the same substance that is ethanol that goes into your gas tank. So it's very internally corrosive. And if you think about, we put the hand sanitizer in order to kill off all the germs and bacteria. But in our gut, we're trying to foster this like healthy bacteria. And we all know about probiotics now, and we all know about this sort of thing. But we drink just a little bit and it totally wipes that out. And all these studies are now showing that that gut health is so important for our mental health. In fact, there's a lot of things coming out about why anxiety and depression has a lot to do with the gut health. So just in general, alcohol is really clear, and this is from Dr. Amen, killing off the flora and fauna in your body. Another fascinating thing, and it's not as scary, but it's a real interesting shift in perspective, and you can do this for yourself, you can try it out, and I highly recommend people do, is that alcohol is a fascinating substance in that it's both a stimulant and a depressant. So it's a stimulant in the sense that when you drink it, your blood alcohol content starts to rise. And as it starts to rise, you feel the feelings that we know alcohol for and we get addicted to. So that's the feeling of like the room feels a little less real, things feel a little fuzzy, we kind of feel a sense of relaxation, euphoria, those sorts of feelings, right? That rising of the blood alcohol content for one drink only lasts for 20 minutes. And it's like people have timed it 18 minutes, 15 minutes, 24 minutes, but it's right in that ballpark depending how much you've eaten. And you can time this for yourself. The fascinating thing that happens though at that time is your body says, hey, whoa, this is toxic. And so it does everything to try to purge alcohol from the body. In fact, your body will stop regulating blood sugar in order to purge alcohol from the body. It will stop digesting food. All sorts of other processes go offline so that your body can purge alcohol. And that's what tolerance is. Tolerance is literally your body getting better and better at purging and protecting you from a drink. So you feel the drink for less time. As soon as that happens and your body turns into that fighting the alcohol mode, you're actually purging the alcohol from your body. Your blood alcohol content starts to fall. As it starts to fall, the feelings associated with blood alcohol content falling are those depressant effects. You feel anxious, you feel uneasy, you feel uncomfortable in your own skin, you might feel tired, you feel uncertain, you might feel, and usually right around that 20-minute mark, what do? We pick up another drink. But I would challenge people to just be like, go an hour, have one drink in an hour. Experience those 40 minutes because they bring you down lower than you were before you picked up that first drink. And when people see that, and then it's cumulative. So our blood alcohol will fall for 2 to 3 hours for one drink. So I'll say it again, it will rise and give us those nice feelings for 20 minutes and then fall for 2 to 3 hours. And it's cumulative per drink. Now, the second drink won't give you as much of a buzz, and we all know that's true. It never feels as good that second and third drink, but we keep doing it because we're trying to stave off the blood alcohol. What we're doing now is mitigating that blood alcohol falling. The reason it doesn't give you as much of a buzz is because your body's also dealing with all the chemicals to purge the alcohol. So you can't experience that much of a buzz the second or third or fourth drink. And that cumulative effect, that 2 hours becomes for 2 drinks 4, for 3 drinks 8, for 4 drinks 10. And so then we wake up anxious the next morning and we have all of those feelings, those depressant effects of alcohol the next morning, but we don't tie it into the drinks we had the night before. Right. Yes, we do with the hangovers, but with that sort of anxiety, that low level sort of uncomfortableness, we're not saying, oh yeah, that was the drinking.
Which amps up the anxiety. Tell me this. We know that it's not good for us. We know that there. So, talk about the role of the unconscious thinking that you talk about relative to why people do it when they know that there's really nothing good about it.
Yeah, so much of our beliefs about what we do habitually, and alcohol definitely becomes a habit. And I think for a lot of us, it's much more of a habit than it is an addiction. In fact, according to the CDC, only 10% of excessive drinkers are chemically addicted to alcohol. So 90% of excessive drinkers are not chemically addicted to alcohol. So
That's so interesting, Annie.
right?
That's really interesting. But keep going. I'm sorry.
But we still drink more than we want. We still have ill effects. But the vast majority of us are, well, it's a habit. And where do habits live? Habits live in our subconscious, because what a habit is when we do something enough times or believe something enough times, our brain puts it on autopilot to free up energy to think of, other things. It's how human beings are efficient. And so I believed things like alcohol relaxed me, like I believed the sky was blue. And I believed it because of my experience of that first 20 minutes of feeling like it relaxed me. That's what my conscious mind and my subconscious would connect to the drink. And I also believed it because everybody said it. Because you turn on the TV and, the detectives, they're out having a beer after that hard homicide case, or, everybody's. And so I also believed that alcohol was fun. Like I believed the sky was blue. Like I believed it without even questioning it. And that's the thing about the subconscious belief systems, is that if we don't take the time to say, wait, is that true? They just live and they kind of run our lives without us even realizing it. And so how that manifests is we end up having cravings. So we feel stressed and we'll have a physical craving because our subconscious is saying, hey, this is what we need. We have a physical craving. Now, interestingly, they have done studies to show that you can respond to stimuli on an emotional or subconscious level, which are basically the same thing, because your emotions are very much in your body. Your subconscious are your neurons all throughout your body, up to 7 seconds before you're consciously aware. So if we were to be like 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, and it's a long time. And so what happens is you have that craving, you feel like you need a drink, and you just go for it. There's not even a conscious intervention. Then once we decide, okay, well, I want to stop drinking, and we don't actually start to look at our subconscious belief systems about alcohol, we just add willpower to that. So now we have this whole desire that's subconscious, and we're fighting it with this willpower. And the thing about willpower is it acts like a muscle. So if you've used all your willpower earlier that day, like you've gone to the gym, you've had a really hard workout, and then it's hard to pick up the shampoo bottle later, same thing. If you've had a hard day, if you've been, which is usually when you're prompted to drink, and then you're trying to say no to a drink, you don't have any of your willpower muscle left to actually, use your willpower to say no to that drink. And so then you let yourself down, then you feel blame and shame, then subconsciously again, you have primed yourself to drink when you feel pain. And this whole cycle continues. And that's why it's so important for us to get really clear on what's happening, because we as human beings, our brains are incredible, and we're not like mice. Whereas if a mouse trap went off, they might go back in that trap the next day, or they might see their friend in the trap and then they're going to go in the trap. When we can understand, oh, this is what's happening in the brain. And that's really the mission of my work. I'm never saying alcohol's bad or stop drinking forever. Everybody needs to get sober. I don't believe any of those things. I don't believe any substance can be inherently all bad or all good. I just really want to give people their own agency back with knowledge and education so that they can make decisions that are right for them. And I think that's really unique, because everything else is saying, no, it's just bad and you just shouldn't. And and if it's hard for you, you're not doing it right.
Yeah. I love how you talk about that. I've heard you say that, right? That if somebody told me this was going to be miserable, I was going to do. I mean, I can't remember exactly how you talk about it, but it's sort of I wouldn't want to do that. I'll just keep drinking. What the hell? I don't want to do that. So it's so interesting. So and there is, the amount of unconscious, the marketing, right? After I learned about you and your work, I started to sort of pay attention to the level of marketing that exists around this, Annie, and it is so staggering. And at some level, that's all feeding the unconscious. At some level, so question for you: How do you define addiction? And why do some people, right? You said 90% aren't, 10% are, according to the CDC. How do you define it? And why do some people fall into that and others not? to the definition of addiction, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So for simplicity's sake, just to, make the conversation really accessible, I just define it as anything that you're doing that you don't want to be doing anymore, that you want to do less of. Now, that's not like the clinical thing. The clinical thing is that you have cravings and that your body actually reacts to the substance in a way that feels very out of your control. In fact, they've put people into MRI machines who are addicted to certain substances and showed them images of the substance. And what happens in the brain when you are chemically addicted is your prefrontal cortex, or the part of your brain that makes decisions, it actually goes dark, and the back of your brain, the primal part that responds to cravings, lights up. So you're in a very intense, like, physical battle as well. But the interesting thing about that physical battle, and what's so sort of disheartening about our existing, recovery systems, is that we deal with that physical battle in rehab centers, often with additional medication and additional drugs, but we don't necessarily do all the work to handle the belief systems. Because even when you're physically addicted to a drug or to alcohol, that physical aspect, the actual substance is purging from your body relatively quickly, within 24 hours to 72 hours. And then your brain is rebalancing to recognize life without the substance it's come to expect, usually within 10 days or 2 weeks. And so you're in that period, and then your body is not actually physically addicted to it anymore. All the problems are on the mental side. And so as we've defined it as this physical problem, and we take you away from the substance, we give you medication, we separate you, yes, we can get you safely off and detox you, but then if we send you back into the world with all of the same thoughts and belief systems that you have, no wonder we have such abysmal success rates. And so I think it's really, no matter where you are on this entire spectrum, the important thing, whether you're having, maybe you're having a few more beers than you want, and you're kind of like, oh yeah, like, I don't like how this is looking around my stomach. And it's still the mental piece that needs to be looked at. Why are you doing it? What do you believe it's giving you? Is it actually giving you that thing? And I love that we can try that on for ourselves, right?
Sure.
Like, when I started asking, is alcohol actually relaxing me? I'd be like, no, it feels like it is for 20 minutes, but then I feel more stressed. And then the next morning, I'm certainly more stressed than the night before, because now I'm dealing with the repercussions. And we can really, and that's what I love about the experiment idea and the experiment mentality, is it's allowing us to kind of put like the white scientific lab coat on in our own lives and sort of look at our experience with no shame and no blame, just radical curiosity and compassion, because we're not drinking because we're broken. We're not drinking because there's something morally wrong with us. These are, again, ideas that have seeped into our collective subconscious. We're drinking because we just have been given this tool. Society has literally said, this is the tool. If you're a mom and you're stressed, all your friends bring you bottles of wine. If you're celebrating, everybody's popping the champagne.
Yeah,
if you're at a
sure.
wedding, it's just been what we've been given. And so I like to say we are all doing the best we can with the tools we have. And when we can just take a little moment and stop judging ourselves so harshly for our behavior, because as soon as we realize we don't want to be doing something, but we keep doing it, we don't necessarily take the time to understand why we're doing it. We just come in with this huge judgment hammer and make ourselves very wrong for it. And then that actually makes the problem worse.
Is there a genetic component at all, Annie, through your research that is important? I mean, in addition to the belief system and all the stuff, the knowledge to shift the behavior eventually, potentially, is there a genetic component to all of this from an addiction perspective?
So there certainly are genetic components, and it's a fascinating conversation, because they have yet to be able to say, okay, you have, and with all the advances in sort of medicine and mapping genetics, you really would think that we would be at a point where we could say, okay, you have these genes, therefore you should be more cautious. We've never gotten to that point. The fascinating thing about it is it's usually the same sort of genetic aspects that also create ADHD, that also create, like, which is interesting because most entrepreneurs have ADHD. A lot of intense athletes or Navy SEALs also have these genetic components, because the things that the genes are doing, it's not necessarily that there's a gene that's saying, hey, you drink alcohol. There's a gene that's saying maybe you have a lower dopamine sensitivity. So it takes more activity or more adrenaline or more adventure or more alcohol to get the same dopamine response as another person. So a lot of these genetic components are things that can be superpowers, the ability to want to try new things, to be a risk taker, but they can also lead to addiction. So it's a really fascinating conversation. I think one of the things that is commonly sort of known is that when a child grows up in an alcoholic household, and they are more likely to overdrink or to fall into addiction. And that's pretty clear. But they haven't been really clear on why that is genetically. And I think the interesting aspect of that is that it makes a lot more sense to me personally, and this is my own theory, that alcohol numbs the brain. It makes it so your neurons fire slower. It takes you out of pain. In fact, they used to use it way back in the day for surgeries before we had safer alternatives for anesthetic. And so when you are in a household that is unstable, that feels unsafe, that you never know which version of your parent you are going to get, and you are drenched in this trauma and anxiety of that instability, and you have your first drink and it feels like peace for the first time in your life, the likelihood of you continuing to use that tool to self-medicate is very high. And I think it's just simple that way. It's not necessarily genetic. It's just that if we are in trauma or in pain, and Dr. Gabor Mate has done some brilliant research on the links between heavy addiction and trauma, and they absolutely are there. But it's because these substances help us escape. They help us manage. And while my work admittedly is much more focused on kind of the every person who's just over drinking and maybe in corporate, we all do have various forms of trauma, of upset, of discontent. And anytime we're using the substance to self-medicate, it can, become problematic.
What's so interesting is you would at some level think that if you're in a home where potentially the parents have a issue and you see the negative impact that it is having on their lives, that you would potentially want to create a system by which you live without it because you've seen the negative impact. But that's not what you're saying. That's interesting.
Well, it's fascinating because my podcast is just people telling me their stories. And I think we have 650 episodes or something now of just people telling me their stories. And over I hear this story. I can't believe this happened to me because when I was growing up, I swore I would never be like my mom. I would never be like my dad. And so I can't tell you why that is. And I do think there are people who, because of their negative experience with alcohol in the home, say, not for me, and they stick to that. But it looks very different than how your parent might have been drinking that first time you're invited out to a happy hour, or you're at a ladies' brunch and you get offered the champagne. And guess what? The same triggering in your brain of wow, that made me feel better. It feels like I'm in a totally different experience than my childhood. And so we don't necessarily connect it. And so I don't know why, but I do know that over and over that has been a theme of I can't believe this happened to me because I swore I wouldn't let it because of my parents.
What would you tell somebody that wanted to start to change their relationship with alcohol but doesn't really know where to start? Where would you tell them to start?
I think the most important thing to start with is just really letting yourself off the hook. I mean, it's, letting go of all that just intense heaviness around this conversation. Approach it like you want to, maybe eat a few less donuts or something. Just let's let go of the heaviness, let go of the fear. You're not an alcoholic. There's kind of no such thing. And you've been doing the best you can with the tools you have. And then through that sort of act of self-compassion, we really are able to awaken curiosity, because judgment and curiosity cannot coexist. And I do believe that curiosity is a main pathway to understanding your own relationship with alcohol, right? How long does it really make me feel good for? When I was doing this in my life, because I was still drinking the whole time that I was researching, I remember walking out of my home office and going to this specific cabinet that I kept the wine in and opening the cabinet, and I noticed that I felt better as I opened the cabinet.
Wow.
I felt the relief that I was expecting. I was like, oh, okay. And my mood changed, and I was like, whoa, I haven't even drank it.
Right.
Or, you feel better as soon as you take the first sip. There's no way it's gotten into your bloodstream yet. It definitely takes a few minutes, but you feel better. And it's so that curiosity can't exist when you're just oh, well, just judging yourself so hard.
Yeah. That's cool. What are some of the questions that you should ask yourself before you stop? Stop the behavior. What are some of the questions you should ask yourself?
Well, I really believe that our beliefs around alcohol that we need to explore, get curious about, and rewire, they're really at three different levels. And so there's the beliefs about the substance itself. And so you just really want to understand what you think it does for you, right? What do you believe this substance actually does for you? And does it relax you? Does it help you loosen up in the bedroom? Does it help you be a better networker? Does it give you, I remember I used to like carbo load before a marathon with beer and then drink after the marathon. I
No
thought it helped my
way.
performance. So
Wow.
what does it do for you? And that's the substance related beliefs. So just getting clear on those so that you can start to be curious, is that really true? And then the next layer is society, community. So what are your fears around if you stop or you drink less? What do you believe could happen? And again, just bring those through the liminal space into the conscious mind, right? What do you think could happen? Because so much of what drives us without our knowing is just buried in the subconscious. And so if we say, okay, well, I actually am worried that I'm not going to get that promotion because my boss owns a winery, I don't know. Or
Right.
I'm worried that like a lot of people are very concerned that their partners that their relationship will change because they kind of schmooze and booze every evening with their partner, and that's how they connect. And so getting those things out and understanding, like, what am I afraid of at a society level? And then the third level, and I think the most important work that any of us can do as human beings, is the beliefs about self, right? What are the things that you are self-medicating away from in terms of how you show up in the world? Is it anxiety? Do you feel depressed? Do you feel unworthy? Do you feel like you're not good enough to be or do a certain thing that you want to do? Do you have judgment of yourself for your past behaviors or how you're living your life? And really getting those beliefs down. And a lot of those beliefs, I think everybody should sort of look at anyway, but it's the trifecta of those three layers that kind of constitute why we drink.
Hmm. That's interesting. What are some of the ways as people, Annie, potentially find themselves shifting their behavior and then they find themselves in an environment socially? What advice do you have for people on how to navigate that without them coming off as if they're judging others, but also feeling at peace inside of themselves in these moments when they're not drinking?
So, a very simple one is we just don't like to say no as people. And so if someone asks you, would you like a drink? You can say, yes, I'd love an iced tea, or yes, what, I need a Coke. I just need a little bit of caffeine first, or yes, do you have any coffee? I just really need to pick me up before we get started. Simple things like that just allow you to say yes, and you don't have to say no, and the conversation can get closed really
Got
quickly.
it.
I
Okay.
think the other thing that's important is that this conversation expands or contracts in most cases based on your energy around it. And so if you're going in, and I've done it all the ways, you're going in and trying not to drink, and you're like, oh, I'm trying not to drink right now. Literally, the person offering you the drink is going to think it's their mission in life to get you to drink because they're feeling bad for you, because you've come with kind of this like, oh, I'm just trying not to. But if you're like, you know what, I'm taking a break, and yeah, do you have any water? Then you kind of close the conversation. And
Mm-hmm.
I would say that you can be as vulnerable about your own decisions as you want to, but often we feel the need to over-explain ourselves, and it's just not necessary. Like we don't have to over-explain ourselves. And then the last thing that I would say is that when somebody is taking issue with you not drinking, it is almost always, if not always, a representation on how they are feeling. Usually, if people have no issue with their own drinking, they're taking no issue with you not drinking.
Mm-hmm.
But if they have any niggle that their behavior is not where they want it to be, then they are going to be the ones taking issue or saying something or making a comment about you. And if it's somebody who you love or who is close to you, I think we have to understand that change in any relationship, no matter how positive the change, is difficult because it's a change.
Sure.
And usually that change comes across in, I feel like you might not think I'm okay anymore. Or what if you judge me? Or what if I'm not good enough for you? Or what if you think you're too good for me? How is this going to affect things between us? And so, especially in intimate relationships, I'm like, just give the person a lot of security that nothing's changing between the two of you. You're just doing this for a little while. And when you kind
Mm-hmm.
of nip that in the bud from the get go, then a lot of the anxiety can be relieved.
Mm-hmm. How, as a parent, my husband and I have three daughters, how should we talk to our kids? And so many of our listeners have children. How do you talk to your kids about it? I know you have two boys.
Yeah,
Talk
I actually based on my two boys and my brother's three girls, and I actually have a daughter as well now. But I wrote a book, and it's called Buzz to Buzzkill, and I thought about this, and it was like, what would I want? What would I have wanted to know before my first drink? And I was actually talking to, starting like 8, 9 through like 14, 15. They're so curious about the world, and they're so scientifically minded, and they're so able to understand really complex things. I mean, if you're not kind of a student to your kids, I think, you're
Yeah.
missing something beautiful
Right,
about
right,
them.
right. Sure.
And so I was, just in a conversation with some of my nieces, and I was like, you guys know what I do, right? And I was like, what questions do you have? And, they were asking me a few questions, and I was like, would you like to know what I wish I would have known? And I just gave really the four main things, according to science, that I wish I would have known before I picked up my first drink. And they shifted in that conversation because, again, so much of what we're doing, it's just unconscious. We're just doing it because other people are doing it. We're not taking that moment to say, should I do this? Is this good? Is this useful? And so all that does is kind of insert that moment and allow them, again, agency, right? You're not telling them what to do or what not to do, which
Right.
guaranteed will make your kids do exactly what you say not to. You're just giving them the agency through information.
So what are those things that you would recommend? What are those four things that you would want people to know?
So the first one was about that blood alcohol rising and falling. I think
Okay.
that's like really, I call it an unfair trade in the book.
Yeah,
And
that's cool. Yep.
yeah, it's so important. The second one is really about how we are all just like subconsciously acting out things that we don't even realize we're acting out. Um, and I am blinking on the last two.
My guys can cut
What's in
this
the
out,
book?
so don't worry.
Okay. Um, I can
And
look.
it's okay if you don't want to hit on them, but it
No,
just felt
I don't mind
interesting.
it. I actually probably have a copy of of it. Um, if you don't
It
mind me.
just felt so interesting. I mean, those four things that you wish you knew.
Yeah,
It
no,
was
it's
interesting
it's
for people
really
to know.
interesting. I'm just totally having a.
Well, it's like what? It's pretty early out there, isn't it?
Oh, it's not too bad. It's 8:30. Um, okay, just give me a second and let me log in here.
Are you okay on time?
Yeah, I'm great.
Okay, okay.
You?
Yeah, for sure.
Cool.
When you have them, I can hit you with that question one more time, and then you can just react.
Okay, perfect. Here we go. Table of contents.
That's when you know you got a lot of content, girl.
I know. Okay.
You're good?
Let me just write them down just to make sure. I think I'm going to be good, but let me just write them down. Um, Okay, I'm good.
All right, let's do this. Thank you, girl. This is good stuff. So, what are those four things that you wish you knew when you were a kid and that you think is great for us to share with young people before they ever have their first drink?
Oh, yeah. So the first one is the fact that actually dopamine, we get really confused about the chemical dopamine. So we think that dopamine is the like happy or liking molecule. And dopamine is interesting because it's actually it starts like that, but it's actually really the wanting molecule. And so what this means very specifically and how I explain it to kids in the book is through video games. They've all had the experience of or candy, eating way too much candy and then the candy stops tasting good. Or they're playing video games and it's so much fun and then 4 or 6 hours later video games are making them miserable. And that's because what's happening is that in the body, the dopamine is encouraging you. It's saying, hey, that thing you just did, do that thing again. And actually, that thing you just did, that thing is necessary for your survival. So dopamine shows up when we're doing something like a first-person shooter video game because we used to have to target practice or, hunt and kill for our survival. Or candy because food and sugar, right? Now, substances like alcohol, they artificially stimulate that dopamine. So it's saying in the brain, as soon as you have your first drink, it's saying, do that thing you just did again, and you need to do it in order to survive. But the thing is, it's not making you like it anymore. So you're going to like it a little bit, but then over time, that liking of it goes down and down and down. But the wanting of it, because that dopamine molecule is heavily at work, is going up and up and up. And so just like a video game that makes you feel really miserable after too much of it or like too much candy, alcohol is artificially stimulating that dopamine. It's at artificially high levels. And so it's getting you to want to do something well after you like doing it. And that's why, they can see adults who drink until they're sick or, drink until they're massively hungover. It's because of that dopamine response. So that's number one. Number two is fascinating. What happens in the brain is actually alcohol numbs our ability to experience joy. And so it does that in this somewhat complicated way, but what basically happens is that we build up a tolerance for joy. So as we drink, certain things are released in the brain. And in order to combat those overly excited or overly happy feelings of euphoria, the process of tolerance or purging is the brain releases a counterchemical called dynorphin. I like to remember dynorphin because it sounds like endorphin, but it's kind of its evil twin. Now, dynorphin actually brings down the pleasure center in the brain. The body will purge alcohol relatively quickly, but you are left with this residual dynorphin levels in the brain, which bring down the pleasure. So it used to be that if you were doing something like that dynorphin can stay in your body for 24 to 48 hours. So if you drink regularly, something that you used to like to do without a drink, you no longer like to do without a drink. And we know that this is true because we used to love to just go to a sporting event when we were kids. But then all of a sudden, we need the beers to be able to enjoy it. Or we used to love going out to dinner, but all of a sudden, we need the glass of wine. And so what happens over time is that we are breaking through that counterchemical that's actually dampening our joy and pleasure. And what happens is that we lose our ability to experience pleasure with the little things, like maybe just a meal doesn't feel as good anymore, or a walk with a friend doesn't feel as good anymore, because we have this ever-present level of dynorphin, which is that counter-chemical to happiness. The third thing is really what we talked about before, that idea of that unfair trade, that you get 20 minutes of a buzz for 2 to 3 hours of a downer. And that's such a big eye-opener for kids. And then the fourth thing is just really that this journey is so slippery. And I really talk about this metaphor of a pitcher plant, which was originated by Alan Carr. And it's this idea that the pitcher plant is this kind of carnivorous plant, but when a bee goes into it, it's sipping on this really sweet nectar, it's enjoying it, but what it doesn't realize is it's slipping very slowly down into the plant. And once it slips down in there and it looks around, it's like, it's okay, I want one more sip, I want one more sip. And this is all things that happen chemically in the brain to get us to want one more drink, no big deal. I'll fix this later, I'll deal with this later. So as we see things getting worse, as we see ourselves slipping further and further down into the plant, we still think, oh, but I can escape. I have wings, no big deal. I can put this down. And I remember this from my own experience. I really thought, like, I can put this down at any time. I can just I can just stop at any time. And what we don't realize is that as we get further and further, that's getting stickier and stickier. And in the pitcher plant example, it gets kind of morbid, but I think it's very powerful and it's all illustrated. But in the pitcher plant example, the juice, the nectar is actually created from the bodies of all the other bugs that have been trapped by the plant.
Wow.
And so you're looking around and you're realizing that this thing that you thought was so life-giving and connected you with your friends and made things more fun is actually really just kind of this nectar of death, and it's stealing life from you. So it's a little lighter than that in the kids' book, but it's that basic premise that it's a real slippery slope.
Any advice on how to approach someone that you care about who you may feel like has a problem?
Yeah, I actually created a course, and it's a free course. And if your listeners want to email us at hello@thisnakedmind.com and ask for this course, I'm happy to just send it over. It's called Helping a Loved One, and it's just like 6 videos about how to talk to someone you love, because there's so much that is not useful. And I think the main premise is that however much you might be frustrated with this person, they're probably equally as frustrated with themselves, but they don't feel like they can admit it because they have no idea how to stop. And they don't want to feel like any more of a failure than they already are. And there's numerous studies that have actually shown that really compassion, most importantly self-compassion, but also compassion from people around us and understanding is the most important thing that you can do. And so the course goes into the science behind that, but it also talks about, okay, well, as humans, we have this need and desire to help and fix, and if we're not doing that, we feel very useless and we feel very afraid. So how do you manage taking care of yourself while someone you love is over drinking?
And you have a bunch of resources. I know, Annie, is there anywhere that you would recommend somebody start if they want to start this journey of discovery and knowledge and getting inside of your, what I believe is just a game-changing shift in such a positive way around this often heavy topic? Where would you want somebody to start?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think one of the easiest things, if you're just curious about it, especially if you want to sort of just take a break, dip a toe, experiment in your own life, but with the neuroscience and the rewiring information, is the alcohol experiment. It's always free. It's on an app. It's off Facebook. And so it's private. You can go and do that. And it's just at alcoholexperiment.com. And then I think the other easiest ways are just the book. I have a book called The Alcohol Experiment, and of course the book, This Naked Mind.
All right, I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire. You ready?
Ready.
What's your morning or evening routine?
Oh, it's so interesting. I am such a person that craves and needs variety, and I know this about myself. So I have all sorts of different tools and things, and it will morph and change kind of depending. So in the mornings, sometimes I just read, sometimes I meditate, often I exercise, but it's one of those sort of different things. And evening, again, it's reading. I read probably more than anybody I know. And so it's usually reading. I'm also putting all 3 of my kids to bed, usually in the evenings.
Yeah.
So admittedly fall asleep in their beds more often than I'd like to.
Hey, that's where you get the best snuggle time, girl.
Yeah.
That's my favorite. What's your favorite book?
Oh, my favorite book. Oh, this is a great question. Oh, this is a hard question because I've read so many books.
Sure.
Just one book that I really have loved is Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, and it's it's not a self-help book. It's just an entertainment book, but I have absolutely loved that book.
What advice would you give your younger self?
Just to be gentler all along the way. A lot more gentleness.
What are things that maybe people get wrong about you, or maybe a common misperception about you given the work that you do?
I think that they think that I hate alcohol, identify as kind of being in recovery. I definitely, none of those things. I'm really open-minded. I really don't have any of those thoughts or beliefs. I think kind of in a live and let live. And so, yeah, people put me in their bubble because that's where they are.
Well, and at some level too, it's so much of what this society has communicated. In the last year, what's a new habit or ritual that has most improved your life?
Oh, I went to Byron Katie's School of the Work, and she has a 4-question process to question your thoughts last March. And I've been doing it ever since, and it has been a total game changer.
Oh, that's cool. When you feel overwhelmed or maybe unfocused, anxious, what do you do?
Meditate.
Mm. What
Yeah.
are you reading, watching, or listening to right now?
I'm reading Your Symphony of Selves, a
Mm.
very good book about all the different parts and pieces that are in us. I just rewatched Wednesday, which was delightful, even the second time around. And this morning on my way to the office, I listened to Byron Katie's podcast.
I love it. So the show's called Game Changer. So who or what is a game changer to you and inspires you and why?
I'm going to stick with Byron Katie. I have been so blown away by this most simple process of just looking at your thinking and asking if it's true and understanding how it makes you feel and behave and finding compassion through not having to change anybody or anything but yourself.
Mm. And it's Byron Katie, and her podcast is Byron Katie,
Yeah, her process is called The Work.
The Work.
And yeah,
Cool.
she's not super
Nice.
young anymore, but she is just doing incredible work and kind of like the best kept secret in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And you are not a best kept secret anymore. You've changed the world, you've changed the conversation around this, and you've impacted so many people's lives, Annie Grace, in such incredible ways. Thank you for the work that you do.
Oh, thank you, Molly. Thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure.